Well, take your Bibles out and turn to the book of Exodus. You will need a Bible open and in your lap this morning. If you don't have one, you can grab one from the rack in front of you. The page number for Exodus 16 is page 58 in the black Pew Bible. We're going to be looking at the entire chapter this morning, all of chapter 16, in a message I've entitled, Mannafest Glory. And for you spelling people, yes, I know I spelled manifest wrong. I took it from the word manna, obviously, that's going to be revealed in our study today, and also the glory of God is revealed in our study, thus manifest glory. I heard about a young woman who brought her brand new fiancé from college to Thanksgiving dinner with her parents. And as they ate dinner together, the mother kind of nudged the father and said, "Hey, take him aside and see if you can find a little bit about him." So sure enough, he says, "Hey, would you come into the living room with me?" And they begin to have this conversation. And so the father says, "So what are your plans?" And the young man says, "Well, I am a biblical scholar. I study the Bible." A biblical scholar. Well, great. That's admirable, but how do you intend to provide a home for my daughter? Well, I will study the Bible, and God will provide. Okay. Well, you haven't given her an engagement ring yet. How do you intend to purchase an engagement ring worthy of my daughter? Well, I study the Bible, and God will provide. Well, I'm sure you want to have children. What are your plans to support a family, to have children? I'm a biblical scholar. God will provide. So this conversation went on, and after they left, the mom said to the dad, "Well, how did the conversation go?" "Well, I'll tell you how it went. He has no job, he has no plans, and he thinks I'm God." The reality is, we do have a God who provides. We have a God who sustains. We have a God who has promised to meet all of our needs, and he's proven himself again and again, not only to us, but in the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus, God has proven himself as the God who will provide. He's done that by freeing over nearly 2 million slaves from Egypt, from the oppression and the bondage that they were under in Egypt, by the outstretched mighty hand through the 10 plagues that he did. We saw his provision for them as they're backed up against the Red Sea, literally between a rock and a hard place as the Egyptian army is barreling down upon them. And he parted that Red Sea and they walked through on dry ground. He provided for them in that he gave them ongoing protection from Egypt, because when they followed on what would be dry ground, he brought the water down upon them and destroyed the Egyptian army. He led them, the whole people of Israel, to a place that they thought was going to be an oasis, but it turned out to be bitter water, undrinkable water. He provided for them again and told Moses to throw a log in the water, and the water became sweet. And then God led them to a place that I called Palm Springs. It was 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and there was plenty of water to drink there. The actual name of the place was Elim. They would not stay there forever, though. In fact, that's where we pick up in our passage today. They're leaving Palm Springs. They're leaving Elim. And so we're going to actually read the entire chapter during our study today. We're going to start off by looking at the first 8 verses of chapter 16. This is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we, that you grumble against us? And Moses says, when the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. Now, what we have seen so far in our study through the book of Exodus is that God has orchestrated every episode. God orchestrated every single scene that we've seen. It is God, now that they have left Egypt, that is leading them by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. It was God who led them to the different places. And listen, it is God who created in them and who has created in us this need to eat. We have a desire, a need for food. God has created in our brains a signaling device that tells us when we need to eat. And you can tell by looking at me, I respond to that signaling device very well. We can hear it, we can sense it when we're hungry, when it's time to eat. God created the human body such that it needs food. And so what does he do? He leads them out by the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, to a place where there is no food. This is not an accident. They're not lost. God has intentionally designed to make the people feel hungry in a place where there are no meals in sight. This is exactly where he wanted them to be, feeling exactly what he wants them to feel. And they respond exactly like we might expect they would respond. They grumble. And that really leads to the first thing I want us to consider, the problem of grumbling. The problem of grumbling. You know, we often categorize sins. We think of major sins, major crimes, and then there are other sins that are more, we might say, respectable. And grumbling is probably one of those. Now, grumbling is a type of sin that we universally dislike in other people, but we regularly justify it in ourselves. So I've got a right to grumble. I've got a right to complain. Now, I want to make this distinction up front so that we're not misunderstanding. When I speak of grumbling, when the Bible talks about grumbling, it's not the same as grieving. It's not the same as groaning even, this lamentation or being sad. See, the last thing I want to do is for you to leave this place and think, well, I got to have a stiff upper lip. I've got to just put my head down. I've just got to make sure that I go through without any kind of grief. No, that's not what I mean. There are all kinds of examples of godly people in the Bible who have it hard and they grieve. They're sad. There's a whole book in the Bible called Lamentations. Sometimes we sing in a minor key. But grumble is not the same as groan. A groan is hands up to God, palms open, saying, oh God, why? A grumble is clenched fists. God, why? And it leads to rebellion. The reality is, we grumble all the time. We do. We grumble regularly. I would bet that most of you have already grumbled sometime today about something. Again, it's easy for us to see it in other people. We can certainly, as parents, see it in our kids when they grumble, right? Are you with me? We can see it when they grumble. They don't listen. They're ungrateful. They don't pick up their dirty clothes. They didn't hang the towel up. They don't finish their food. They didn't do their homework. They don't like to take naps when they're little. All these things we grumble about, but we grumble too. We grumble about our kids. I just did. We grumble about what they do. We grumble about the church. We grumble about the weather. We grumble about the bad officiating of whatever game we just watched. We grumble about traffic. We grumble about our jobs. In fact, I would say it would be altogether appropriate if we changed the social media site Facebook to Grumble Book. Because most of what people post on there is grumbling. They're grumbling about politics. They're grumbling about the old man in the White House or the old man that might be in the White House. They're grumbling about everything. grumble book. Well, what I want us to see from this passage are really three things that are wrong with grumbling. Three problems with grumbling that show us it really is a dangerous sin. The first thing is this. Number one, grumbling distorts the past. Grumbling distorts the past. Remember, they lingered by the palm trees at Elim and by the springs of Elim for several weeks, but they could not stay there. So verse 1 says they set out from there and they went to a wilderness area, Sin. Now, that's just a coincidence that they did a lot of sinning while they're in Sin. The name of the place has nothing to do with our English word for sinning. It's connected to the region of Sinai, hence it's called the place of sin. And there they encountered a crisis, a very real crisis. Food is scarce. They're hungry, and they start to grumble. And notice that in their grumbling, how they distort the past. Look at verse 3 again. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. Now, just an aside here, I think meat pots would be a great name for a buffet restaurant. How about you? I'm going to Meat Pots, right? Or an alternative rock band. Ladies and gentlemen, the Meat Pots. I don't know, maybe not. New band name, I called it. Okay, so Meat Pots. And all the bread we want. We ate bread to the full. What are they doing? They're distorting the past. They're distorting what life was really like back in Egypt. And they're only a month removed from Egypt. They sang a completely different tune at the beginning of Exodus. Look at Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. The people of Israel groaned. Remember, I told you there's a difference between grumbling and groaning. They groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. Again, they're singing a different tune now. They're a month removed from slavery, and they're like looking back with rose-colored glasses, looking back at the past with all this nostalgia. Oh, wasn't it so much better back then? We can't relate to that, can we? Those were the good old days. That's when things were really good, way back then. It was so much better. If it wasn't such a serious sin, it would almost be comical what these people are doing. You can just hear them. It's almost like their bottom lip stuck out. They've got their arms crossed. Wish we were back in Egypt with the meat pots, right? They're grumbling. Phil Ryken, in his commentary, I read it every week as I prepare, he said this: they're the opposite of the patriot Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. They said, give us slavery or give us death. They want to go back to bondage. Sometimes all we want to do is go back. We remember the past and we think, oh, it was so much better. Times were really good back then. But here's the thing. Listen, grumbling distorts the past. Here's the second thing grumbling does. Grumbling disrupts the present. Grumbling disrupts the present. Look at the second half of verse 3. The people say to Moses, you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. They're questioning Moses' motives. And this is the second time they've accused Moses with these intentions of murder. Moses, the only reason you came back to Egypt after being out there was so that you could convince Pharaoh to get us to leave, so that he could show the 10 plagues through the power of God. You could see him part the Red Sea. You could bring us out here. Why did you do all this, Moses? Because you want to kill us. That's disrupting the present. That is not his intention at all. What an absolutely absurd and irrational assertion. Pharaoh and leading the people out was for their good, not to get them. And how often do we exaggerate what's going on in the present? Again, we can see this in our kids. Parents, have you ever heard your kids say something like this? When are we going to eat? I'm starving. If you say, I'm starving in my home, you will get a quick lesson on what starvation really is. You are not starving. This is what real hunger looks like. That's exaggeration. That's hyperbole. And this is exactly what they're doing. It can be a very serious sin, exaggerating how destitute your situation is. All of us probably know people that when we hear them talk about something, we have to take what they say with a grain of salt, because their successes are usually very mountainous and their losses are usually very bad. The same is true with the language we use, and this is Premarital Counseling 101. One of the inventories I give counselees in my counseling with them has a lot of questions using the words always and never. And it's a trap. If I'm going to do premarital counseling for you, just know it's a trap for you. I like to see what you're going to say about the always and never questions. Because rarely, ever, is it always or never. Rarely does your spouse always do this or never do that. You never pick up your underwear in the bathroom. Well, sometimes he does, once out of 10, right? Give him a break. So we're disrupting the present. We're exaggerating what's actually happened. We grumble. We tend to use hyperbole, and that's exactly what the Hebrews are doing here. They distorted the past. They disrupted the present. But here's the most serious problem with grumbling. It dishonors God. Grumbling dishonors God. Now, the people would see it as just grumbling against Moses and Aaron. In fact, that's what verse 2 says. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And I would point out, it wasn't some of the people, it wasn't even a majority of the people, it was all the people. The whole congregation grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And I would remind you that they had grumbled against Moses before. They had grumbled with him at the banks of the Red Sea. They grumbled against him at the Mara, the pool that was bitter. And although they think they're just grumbling at Moses and Aaron, Moses actually reveals who the target of their grumbling is. In fact, it's so important that they recognize who they're grumbling against. He says it twice, in verse 7 and in verse 8. He identifies the target of their grumbling. Notice verse 8. The Lord, that's Yahweh, has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him. What are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. They ask the question, what are we? In fact, they asked that question twice. And the translation of the question is, don't shoot the messenger. You're not grumbling against us. Your grumbling is against the Lord. And they could say, no. Our grumbling isn't against the Lord. Yes, it is. Because who's the providential Lord of the universe? Who's the providential God of who's in the White House? Who is it? God. God is the God of providence. Your grumbling is against God. I want you to look at that last phrase of verse 8 again. Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. When I meditated on that sentence, and it hit me right between the eyes, I began to think about how much I grumble about situations, about experiences. And if I understand grumbling correctly, ultimately my grumbling is always directed to God. This truth that our grumbling is against God. Man, if we could puree this truth up in a blender, drill a hole in our skull, take a straw and pour it in, that would be ideal. That we would remember our grumbling is always, ultimately, against God. In fact, look at this next slide. A grumbling spirit indicates something is not right in your relationship with God. If you look in the mirror and you honestly respond, man, I grumble, it's an identifier that something is not right in your relationship with God. We're accusing God when we grumble. You're not taking care of me. You're not providing for me. What are you doing? Playing golf up there with the angels? We're grumbling against God. That's why this cannot just be another respectable sin that we gloss over. This is a serious deal. We're grumbling against the Lord. So what's the answer? What's the answer for constant complaining? What's the answer for a grumbling spirit? That leads to the second thing I want us to see, the plan of God. So God puts forward a plan that will not only demonstrate his loving compassion, his loving concern, but will also be an opportunity for the children of Israel to develop faith, to develop trust, to develop dependence on God. Follow along as I read the bulk of the chapter right now. We're going to look at verses 9 through 30. Follow as I read. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, 'Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.' And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God.' In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, 'What is it?' For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, 'It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it each one of you as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent.' And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, 'Let no one leave any of it over till the morning.' But they did not listen to Moses." Surprise, surprise. "Some left part of it till morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, 'This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning.' So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, 'Eat it today, and for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none.' On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, 'How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day.' So the people rested on the 7th day." So there are 2 lessons in the plan of God for the children of Israel that help them to learn to trust, to help them to learn to depend, to have faith in God. And this is the antidote, this is the plan for their grumbling hearts, and it's the plan for our grumbling hearts too. So what are they? On the other side of slavery, what is God's plan for us? First of all, they needed to learn to trust God to provide. They needed to trust him to provide. Look again at verse 12. "At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." Now, one thing we've seen about God and his activity in the book of Exodus over and over again is that God is a self-revelatory God. What I mean by that is he reveals himself. Again and again, he reveals his character. He reveals his nature. He reveals what he is like. And he does this again. He is the God who makes himself known. We saw that back in chapter 3 at the burning bush, the first time God ever revealed his personal name, Yahweh. This is the God who makes himself known. We saw it in the Red Sea as he parted the Red Sea and they walked through on dry land. We saw it at Marah, the bitter water. God told Moses, "Throw the log in." It became sweet. And God revealed a new name that had never been revealed before, Jehovah Rapha, or Yahweh Rapha. I am the God who heals. So again, the book of Exodus is not just about us getting these little facts and tidbits of Bible trivia. Exodus is revealing to us who God is. He provides for them. He provides for them. He provides quail for them to eat, meat, and he provides all the food they could eat. Now look in your Bibles. Hopefully you still have it open. Look at verse 15. And if you're reading the ESV, in verse 15 it says, when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? There's a footnote there that takes you to the bottom of the page. If you look there, the footnote says this. There's an alternative translation to the Hebrew. It could be what is it, or it could be it is manna. And here's the Hebrew phrase, man who. And so scholars don't know, is this a statement or is this a question? Are the people of Israel gathering this stuff, this bread from heaven, and they're saying, what is it? Or are they saying, it is manna? There's one scholar that I read said, it could loosely be translated, whatchamacallit. What is this stuff? Whatchamacallit? I don't know what it is. Man who? Who knows? Right? So this is what's going on here. They're finding this stuff and they're saying, what is this? What has God done? This is a miracle is what it is. It is sustenance. It is food. It's sweet. I thought of graham crackers. Could you imagine waking up in the morning and find graham crackers in your yard? And I love graham crackers, right? Eating the graham crackers up. And it was there. It was not interrupted by weather. It didn't stop based on the seasons. And it lasted for 40 years. As soon as they got to the edge of Canaan, it stopped. None of the other nations around them got the manna, and it was enough for them to eat. What an expression of favor from the Lord. This is not a natural phenomenon. This is a supernatural miracle of provision. And think about this. They're only a month removed from slavery. If you remember, they left Egypt on the 15th day of the first month. Our episode today started on the 15th day of the second month. They're 1 month removed from slavery, and they're already grumbling. They had been in slavery for over 400 years, and I don't know about you, I would have thought that would bought the Lord at least a few months of gratitude and thankfulness. It's just a month, and they're groaning again. We miss the meat pots. Here's the thing. God set them free, and God determines to take care of them after he set them free. And he is revealing, even in this episode, one, he has the capacity to provide, and two, he has the compassion to provide. But I do want you to consider the reality of this situation. We are so far removed from an agrarian society where we have to farm and raise our own food. And we're so far removed from a hunter-gatherer society where we have to live off the produce of the land that we can sometimes miss the crisis that these people are in, right? If I get hungry, what do? I go to my fridge, which is fully full. I go to my freezer, which is overfilled with discount meat. And I go to the pantry, which is also full. Now, last night, I was hungry about 8 o'clock, and I wanted a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The only peanut butter in the pantry was crunchy peanut butter. Amy likes it. If I want to eat peanuts, I'll eat peanuts. I don't want peanuts in my peanut butter. I want it smooth. So what did I do? At 8 o'clock last night, I drove to the grocery store. I got some smooth, creamy Jif, because that tastes the best in my opinion. I got the Jif, I came home, and I made a nice peanut butter sandwich and jelly, strawberry. Get that grape out of here. I can do that, and you can too. They couldn't do that. We're so far removed from this kind of life that we kind of miss it. So this is a real crisis. But what God wanted them to know was that they could trust him. And they could trust him not just in the long term. They needed to learn to trust him daily. Daily the manna came. They didn't collect enough for the week or the month. They had to learn to trust God daily. He says, I'll give you tomorrow's bread tomorrow. You trust me daily. I have to think the Lord Jesus must have been thinking of this when he taught us to pray. Give us this day our daily bread. We love to quote Lamentations 3. We love to sing Lamentations 3. The Bible says this, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. We quote it, we sing it, but do we really believe it? Your mercies are new every morning. Daily bread. I'll trust you day by day. Most of us, we want, okay, God, if you could just give me the roadmap of your grace for the next 10 years, I'll be good. Just let me know what your plan is. Okay, not the 10 years. How about this next year? And God says, daily grace. Mercies are new every morning. Daily bread. So this is the lesson for them. It's the lesson for us. We've got to learn to trust God. He'll provide. Here's the second lesson. We need to learn to trust him enough to pause. We need to learn to trust God enough to pause. Verse 30 says, so the people paused. They rested on the seventh day. Now, for context's sake, I want you to know where we are in the flow of the book, in the flow of the narrative. This is chapter 16. The Ten Commandments will not be given until chapter 20. So this is before, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, is a commandment for Israel. This is before then. This is chapter 16, where God is giving an instruction about a Sabbath requirement. No working on the seventh day. You work 6 days, you take the seventh day as a rest. But as I thought about this instruction that God is giving them here, I asked myself this question: what does taking a weekly day or interval or time of pause, of rest, of Sabbath, what does this have to do with grumbling? What does this have to do with complaining? Because if you think about it, it might produce more grumbling. I've got so much to do, I don't have time to take a day off. You know how much work's going to be piled up on Monday when I get to the office? I can't take a day of rest. I can't pause. Here's the connection. Look at this next slide. We grumble when we don't trust God, and a way we learn to trust God is by regular, intentional times of pause. Regular, intentional times of pause. You see, the same people who tried to outsmart God by collecting more manna so that they just might have enough the next day in case he didn't show up with it are the same people that are scurrying around like busybodies on the Sabbath day. Now, just briefly, with regard to the Sabbath law, there are some elements, there are some principles with regard to the Sabbath law, the Sabbath requirement of the Old Testament. There is some continuity for we who are New Testament Christians, New Testament believers. Now, I pointed out earlier that this was given before the Ten Commandments. This is given before the Mosaic Law, and here's why there's continuity. Because this instruction to pause is rooted in creation. It's rooted in creation. God created the universe in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested from his labor. Now, where I would say this does not apply, and this is not so much an issue for present-day evangelical Christians, but for generations past, here in the South particularly, there were some who created this one-for-one Sunday replaces the Old Testament Sabbath. That is not true. Okay? The Lord's Day, Sunday, does not replace the Old Testament Sabbath day. And here's what I mean by that. These rules and regulations that were created in our culture was there are certain things you can't do on Sunday. You better not wash clothes on Sunday, that's working. You better not wash dishes on Sunday, that's working. And for sure, you better not mow your grass on Sundays because everybody's going to see you're working. Right? Well, I would ask this question, what about me? You know when I get started on Sundays? 4:30 a.m. is when I start working on Sundays. I get home from here about 12:30. I work straight through. By the time I start eating lunch, I've already put in an 8-hour work day. What about me? Am I working on Sunday? Of course I am. So this is not a one-for-one, ritual, legalistic, minutia, you can do this, you can't do that. So what is it? What's the continuity for us in the New Testament? Well, look at this next slide. I worked on this sentence a little while. The principle of Sabbath instructs us to take intentional time to pause in order to rest and recover from labor. This develops trust in God. This is the instruction. This is the carry over to us who are New Covenant Christians. The principle of Sabbath instructs us to take intentional, scheduled times of pause, to rest and recover. This necessity of rest, this necessity of recovery, is seen particularly in elite level athletes. You all know that I'm a huge fan of amateur wrestling, of college wrestling, of Olympic wrestling. And so, as such, I follow several elite athletes on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and I follow them and I watch their stories and I see their posts and their videos. Now, most of the time, what they're posting is kind of technique videos and what they're doing and how they do particular moves. And I always watch those just in case I get called out of retirement and they need me on the team, right? I'm ready to go. But here lately, let me tell you what their posts have been about. You see, we are 2 weeks away from the Olympic team trials for the United States. And each of these guys that are up on the screen, they're all gold medalists, each of them. And they are vying for only 6 spots on the U.S. Olympic freestyle team. So you know what their posts are about right now? Training, intense, incredible, to the end of their energy, training. It makes me tired just watching it. But you know what I saw one of them post the other day? It was actually David Taylor, bottom left there. He posted on his Instagram, recovery day, and it showed him just walking in the yard, walking his dog. Sports scientists know you can't push your body to the end consistently without recovery time, without pause. And this is what the science tells us. This is what the Lord tells us. You have to have time of recovery. You have to have time of Sabbath. When it comes to sleep, when it comes to rest, you can borrow time, but you can never steal time. Here's what I mean by that. It'll eventually catch up with you. Oh, you can stay up all night long working on that project. You can stay up all night long cramming for that test, pounding energy drinks, but it's going to catch up with you eventually. You can borrow time, but you can't steal it. You'll eventually crash. But here's the final point I want us to see. The problem of grumbling, the plan of God to correct that grumbling, but finally I want us to see, you know it's coming, the parallel to the gospel. How do we see Jesus in this episode? Where's Jesus here? Well, I find Jesus really at the end of the chapter. It's very interesting because of what God tells Moses to do with this manna, this whatchamacallit from heaven. Look at verse 31 to the end of the chapter. Now the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey, graham crackers. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it," that's about 2 liters, "and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years, till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah." This was an interesting instruction from God. I'm going to provide this manna for you every day for 6 days a week and for 40 years. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a day's allowance of the manna that one person would get. I want you to put it in a jar and you're to keep it. You're to store it. It's like a museum piece. And what do they eventually do with it? They put it in the Ark of the Covenant. And so, from this time of Moses and Aaron to the time of Christ, for 1,500 years, they had this museum piece, the manna from heaven. This is how God fed the children of Israel for 40 years, 6 days a week, supernaturally. And so I ask this question, why? Why would God instruct them to keep this memorial, this museum piece? Well, Jesus actually answers the question for us. I want to walk you through a very interesting story that really parallels this story. It's from the New Testament. Jesus and Moses, they both encountered a large group of hungry people. Jesus encountered them, and It said it was feeding of the 5,000. It was actually probably more like 20,000 by the time you count women and children. And he fed them miraculously, supernaturally, with 5 loaves and 2 fish. The people all of a sudden become very interested in Jesus. So much so that what do they want? They want him to become their king. They want him to rule over them. Why did they want him to rule over him? They try to take him by force to be their king. Because all of a sudden, all of their economic problems are over. If he can supply food like this, miraculously, supernaturally, we'll never have to go to the grocery store again. Our bellies are full. But not only that, if this is the kind of supernatural power he has, not only do we never have to go to the grocery store again, all of our economic problems are solved, but surely he has the power to overthrow those nasty Romans who are ruling over us. He's our get-out-of-jail-free card. He's our genie in a bottle. And I have no doubt if what they needed was that kind of Savior, Jesus would have signed up for the deal. Sure, take me, I'll be your king. But Jesus knew that's not what they ultimately needed. Jesus knew what they needed was something much deeper than getting their bellies filled with the food that perishes. And so at the end of the chapter, which records the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 and plus women and children, notice what Jesus says in verse 51. John 6, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Jesus proclaims, I'm the bread of heaven. I'm the fulfillment of the manna in the wilderness. This piece of museum history that has been kept for 1,500 years so that you could remember how God sent bread from heaven to sustain you, it was pointing to me. I'm the fulfillment of the bread from heaven. One would think that after Jesus did such a miraculous sign of feeding them, and then he gives them the conditions of being on his team, one would think, well, they're going to love it. Okay, whatever you say. You're the one that did this supernatural miracle that can't be explained. We'll follow you. Whatever the conditions are, we'll agree to them. But that is not what they did. They look at Jesus just like the ancient Israelites looked at the manna and said, what is it? Who's this guy? In fact, notice how some of the Jewish leaders responded in verse 41 and 42. They're just like their grumbling grandpas. Verse 41, so the Jews grumbled. Are you kidding? The Jews grumbled about Jesus because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They said, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down from heaven? He just fed 20,000 people. Friends, it could have been 2 million people. But they grumbled. Nothing has changed from Exodus 16 to John chapter 6. And friends, I'm here to tell you, nothing has changed from John 6 to April 7, 2024. Nothing's changed. They crumble against the Lord and against his anointed. They will not believe him. They will not trust him. They will not submit to him. They will not worship him. Because here's the deal. All the miracles in the world will not change people's hearts and minds towards Jesus. He could have performed 1,000 miracles. All of us are incapable of seeing Jesus as the bread from heaven unless God by his Spirit opens our eyes to see it. This is exactly what Jesus said in the very next verse, 43 and 44. Notice what he says. Jesus answered them, do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. There's a reason you're grumbling. There's a reason you're complaining. There's a reason you're not getting it. Because God, by his Spirit, has not opened your spiritual eyes to see my identity. You can't come to me unless the Father who sent me draws you. This is something which comes about exclusively by the very Spirit of God. And so as we close, I would just simply ask the question, what about you? What about you? Have you seen Jesus for who he really is? The bread of heaven? Have you seen the depth of your own sinfulness? Have you felt the weight of your lostness? I hope that you will see. I hope you'll see things the way Peter did at the end of this chapter 6. See, after Jesus said these things about eating his flesh, a lot of people said, man, that's gross. Many of his quote-unquote disciples, learners, began to walk away. They began to leave. After they had been fed miraculously, they can't handle the truth. And so Jesus comes to the 12. And notice verse 67 and 68 of John 6. So Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And I would ask you, have you come to Jesus with that kind of trust and that kind of dependence and that kind of faith? This is what the whole episode in Exodus 16 is about, developing their faith, their trust, their dependence on God. Have you come to Jesus and said, you alone have life? And I find my satisfaction not in anything else, in any other pursuit, in any other accolade, in any other physical craving. I find life, I find satisfaction in you alone. He is the bread of heaven. And that leads to my last thought. Only Christ brings satisfaction for the hunger of our souls. Let's go to the bread of heaven in prayer.